The Man of Steel returns to face his greatest challenge ever in Richard Pryor? When Johnnie Torch Reviews Superman 3. Well, with the Salkinds unceremoniously showing Dick Donner the door, and by proxy Tom Mankiewicz, before production resumed on Superman 2, Richard Lester, who replaced Donner on Superman 2, took on the directorial duties on Superman 3. Lester's slapstick sensibilities, that were noticeable, albeit unintrusive in Superman 2, take center stage here. As the film opens, not with the epic opening of credits in front of the starfield with John Williams' iconic theme as with the previous films, the credits are squashed into the film's lengthy slapstick intro. Truth be told, I actually grew up with a copy of the ABC version of the film, which opened the movie in a more traditional way. After seeing it that way for most of my life, I can't see how anybody associated with the film thought that opening it the way they ultimately did, theatrically, was the wisest choice. Already, we're off to a shaky start. Lois is quickly and awkwardly written out of the story for a supposed much-needed vacation. Allegedly, the Salkinds were none too pleased with Margot Kidder verbalizing her displeasure with Donner's firing, causing her to get cameo status for this film. While I had my reservations as a kid about losing Lois, so prominent a character in Superman's life, it does give them the chance to shine a light on the other famous woman in Soup's life, Lana Lang. In the comics, she was very much the Betty to Lois Veronica. At this point in the comics of the 1980s, Lana was a slightly more shrewd version of Lois, dividing time between trying to get her mitts on Superman and covering the news as a TV broadcaster with Clark Kent. Kind of a misguided attempt even back then to circumvent the dying market of the newspaper business. Here, she bears little resemblance to her comic counterpart, played with the epitome of earnestness by the lovely Annette O'Toole. An entire generation will remember her as Clark's mom on Smallville, but to us OG fans, she'll always be remembered as Smallville's hottest single mom. The Lana subplot is one of the film's stronger storylines. It does match up rather effortlessly to our brief introduction to her and Brad from the original movie. She's the one that got away from a young Clark, while Brad Wilson, his high school antagonist, reemerges as a boozy jock, eternally reliving his glory days playing high school football, played to perfection by Gavin O'Hurley. Reeve and O'Toole have a pretty palpable chemistry. You can see where Reeve improvises a lot of dialogue with her at the picnic scene. And there's a pretty symbolic motif in their relationship where each always seems to misunderstand the other during conversation. No wonder they never got on the same page as kids. Lana's storyline kinda ends abruptly at the film's halfway point when she decides to finally move from Smallville, mostly to avoid Brad's ceaseless advances, and be her own woman. It's kind of a shame they couldn't find more to do with the character in the second half. But in fairness, it was a good idea to differentiate Lana from Lois. Lana never becomes a damsel in distress for Superman to save, nor does she become a potential love interest for Superman. She's made more unique by taking an interest in Clark instead. You never get the feeling that Lois could be taking her place in this film. Reeve, for his part, chose to downplay some of his more klutzy mannerisms in this film, reasoning that Clark wouldn't have to put on so strong an act outside of the Daily Planet. The absence of Lois also gives Jimmy Olsen a chance for a bit more spotlight than was afforded him in Superman 2, and he becomes the reporter in peril during one of the film's action set pieces set at a chemical plant. Superman saves the day by freezing a portion of a lake and dropping it over the inferno. Perry White is also given a fairly uninteresting subplot where he's running a contest in the Daily Planet that adds even more consternation to his job. As legend has it, Richard Pryor was on a talk show and was asked, "What do you want to do next?" To which he responded, "I'd like to be in one of those Superman movies." Word soon reached the higher-ups, and an offer was made to include him in Superman 3. The problem with this is that it becomes a film of two halves. Put simply, it feels like a Superman film and a Richard Pryor film are running concurrently, and the Pryor film is winning most of the screen time. Now that's not to say Pryor's scenes are completely devoid of charm or humor. I still get a kick out of some of Gus' antics, particularly getting Brad drunk to access his boss's computer, and his enthusiastic pantomiming of Superman's heroics while wearing a pink tablecloth which ends in slapstick fashion by his skiing off the top of the building and landing unscathed on the street below. But it's still an excessive screen time that's given to the character. After all, people are showing up to Superman 3 to see Superman, and not Gus Gorman and his wacky pals. Now, I'm hardly experienced in Richard Pryor's oeuvre. The Pryor portion of the film seems to fit his typical formula. Gus Gorman is a ne'er-do-well who finds he has a particular talent for hacking computers, which he promptly puts to use by stealing his boss blind. This was considered pretty futuristic for its time, I suppose, in those pre-internet days. His boss, Ross Webster, is smart enough to take advantage of Gus's talent, exploiting him until Gus has had enough and turns on his white, rich male benefactor. The late, great Robert Vaughn does a great job with the role. He brings about as much life as he can to this Lex Luthor-light corporate juggernaut character. Vaughn, of course, was famous for starring in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and the original Magnificent Seven. I'll probably always remember him as the A-Team's boss, General Hunt Stockwell, when that series was on its last legs. His unmistakable voice is always a treat. Ross is joined by his ugly sister Vera, whose ugliness is a constant source of ridicule, and it's hinted that she's the brains of the pair and is certainly the most ambitious of the two. At the film's last act, she gets memorably transformed into a cyborg, which scarred many a child for life, including myself. Whenever I'd watch the film on video, I always turned my eyes from the assimilation scene. It was freaky. Rounding out our villains is Lorelei Ambrosi, Ross Webster's whatever. The film goes out of its way to specifically not tell us, so I won't do their job for them here. She's basically a blonde bimbo whose appearance in the film single-handedly manages to set the women's movement back 100 years. They try to suggest that she actually has a brain and merely plays ditzy to amuse her aforementioned white rich male benefactor. Personally, that makes it even worse. They should have just made her a ditz and let her own it. Her biggest contribution to the film comes in a memorable encounter on the Statue of Liberty, where Webster has foisted her out to bait the newly sleazy Superman to do his bidding. Long stretches of time are given to Gus Gorman, but none of this really has anything to do with Superman. Gus only bumps into Clark briefly once, and has one other scene before the end where he takes his newly created synthetic kryptonite, substituting tar for an unknown element, and delivering it as a token of appreciation to Superman in his guise as a 3-star general. It's a long and painfully unfunny scene where even Ilya Salkind admitted it was a mistake. This would have been a great opportunity to introduce red kryptonite into the saga. After all, it doesn't really make much sense to give something that clearly looks like green kryptonite to Superman in front of a crowd of hundreds of onlookers, where any one of them could reach up and remove the kryptonite at the first sign of Kal-El's discomfort. Not the best laid plan. Now, as any fan of this film will tell you, the best part of it is the evil Superman scenes. Reeve takes full advantage of playing against type here by giving us a truly creepy Superman who is the epitome of everything evil. It's a great performance, but I can't help but wonder how it could have been played had Luthor been the villain. Seeing Gene Hackman working his evil influence over a morally bankrupt Man of Steel would have been too good to be true. But Hackman didn't even return for reshoots of Superman 2 after Donner's firing, so that may have been a contributing factor in his absence here. It's also a bit of a missed opportunity to not have Lois involved, and being able to see just how far the love of her life has fallen. But without Luthor's malignant guidance, Supe pretty much settles to drinking, chasing women, and being a general trickster, as in his straightening the Leaning Tower of Pisa for a laugh. Ironically, the evil Superman's costume is made to darken, with the blue getting deeper, and the red turning to burgundy to symbolize his descent into darkness. However, this would be nearly the exact color tone used for his costumes in Superman Returns and the Man of Steel franchise. Hidden meaning? His journey through the dark side culminates when confronted with Lana's son Ricky's dismayed pleading ringing in his ears. At a junkyard setting, Supe splits between his good and evil personas, leading to a comic-esque battle between Clark Kent and Superman. And it is every bit as good as advertised, with his Clark Kent persona ultimately emerging as the victor, literally destroying his evil persona. And as Clark does the famous shirt rip to the sound of John Williams' classic theme, it's truly one of the most majestic scenes in the Reeve series, having gone through the fire with Kal-El only to come out the other side stronger and more pure. This is Superman at his finest. Ken Thorne returned from his work on Superman 2 to score this film as well. He adapted many of Williams' iconic themes from the first film. Helen St. John also created a love theme for Clark and Lana for the film. I really liked the soundtrack album as a kid, playing it over and over on cassette. Some of the songs included briefly in the film were quite good, including Chaka Khan's No See No Cry, and the Smallville anthem They Won't Get Me by Roger Miller, although I was less receptive to Marshall Crenshaw's Rock On. The original conception of Superman 3 was to star one of Soup's perennial villains, Brainiac, the living computer, and supposedly Mr. Mxyzptlk. Admittedly, as a kid, I was hoping for a new villain over another go-around with Lex Luthor, but the only thing really retained from the original concept is the idea of a supercomputer being the main villain that Soup has to defeat. After trying to suffocate the Man of Steel in a large bubble, which kinda doesn't make any sense, it's already established in the series that Kryptonians can breathe in space, the supercomputer detects Superman's weakness as kryptonite and uses a kryptonite ray on him. Gus sees the error of his ways and comes to Soup's aid by smashing the computer's kryptonite ray and attempting to shut down the computer's power source. When that doesn't work, Soup retrieves a container of acid that was introduced earlier in the film that the computer can't sense any danger from, which is the way Soup beats the supercomputer. Frankly, it's a bit of a cheat. With the most powerful superhero in history, you'd expect a much bigger showdown, but with the FX limitations of the day, I can't really expect much more from them. Besides, it's kind of fitting in a battle of Superman versus supercomputer that Superman wins by virtue of his intelligence, not his fists. In the end, Superman drops Gus off in a coal mine. Presumably, Soup lets him go since he saved his life, but it never really feels like Gus has learned anything from his arc. Clark ends up presenting a diamond ring to Lana, which, confusingly, he attributes to Superman. Lana ends up getting a job at the Daily Planet as Perry's new secretary, which sadly doesn't seem to last long as she's omitted from Superman 4. They at least have Lois and Lana meet briefly to sort of hint at some kind of undefined rivalry, before Clark is off again, setting the Tower of Pisa back the way it was. End of story. This is my least favorite of the Reeves Superman films. I think even Superman 4 has more going for it, though that's a subject for another time. Even as a kid, I remember finding myself depressed after this film was over. And at 7 or 8 years old, I was at a loss to understand why I didn't have the same sense of exhilaration at the end of this film as I did the previous two films. I suppose even as a kid, on some level, I could understand that this film really wasn't that good. Having said that, though, I'd watch this film sooner than Superman Returns, Man of Steel, and even Batman v Superman. Christopher Reeve still gives 110% as Superman, and his performance is still unmatched. The return to Smallville, the Lana-Clark semi-romance, and the evil Superman junkyard battle are still all positives that make the film worth seeing. I'm giving Superman 3 3.5 stars out of 5. This is Johnnie Torch reminding you, look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman. And I'll be with you again real soon.